I really enjoyed talking to Paul, Jerry. From a selfish point of view, I didn't hear him talk at the DFP. And I was really sad about it. So I was really pleased that he agreed to come on and talk to us about his experience as a digital forensic investigator and now as a higher assistant psychologist. And just as like a man who wants to make change, like that felt so inspiring and motivating. It was really great having him on. What did you think?
I thought he was such a good example. I mean, I went into psychology later in life as well, and I thought it was such a good example of someone who'd already had one career and one, very important career, made a massive difference in his life already, and then decided to change careers and go into psychology, and then got experience in a hospital, and now going on to study for a PhD. I mean, and his sort of initial, oh, I'm too old to be doing this, luckily overcame that and said, well, why shouldn't I? I'm going to go and do it. And, he's still got many years ahead to study for his PhD, which is going to be, again, groundbreaking. And so it's just fascinating to hear somebody else's journey, and making such a difference in people's lives every single day in the families he's already affected and in the future of protecting DFIs in the future, because that's so important, isn't it? We need to protect the people that are doing this work. And that he's got so much knowledge and experience to bring into psychology. It's just so fascinating. And that somebody would quite casually do one master's and then go and do another one.
I know. I thought I misheard him when he said that. He was like, my first master's, my second
Yeah,
master's. I was like, you do a double master?
yeah, yeah. But
I also thought it was so nice. Like it was moving to see how much emotion was there and how much he was open to sharing that and
mm,
the bravery and just being human about it. And it really linked into what we were saying about just asking how people are and waiting to hear the
mm,
response and being ready to hear
yeah.
that. And he role modeled that today, didn't he?
Yeah, and what a great psychologist he'll be because he'll be doing that all the time, and he knows he's accepted that, and he'll give it to others. So no, it's fascinating. I really enjoyed um, listening to his story.
And we got a Let's Talk Forensic Psychology exclusive, so that was
Yeah,
quite impressive, wasn't
yeah,
it?
exciting.
So now all you have to do is watch this episode to find out what the exclusive was. Here it is.
So in this episode, we're really interested to speak to Paul Gullon-Scott, who was a digital forensic investigator and wellbeing lead, working with the police for many years, and is now a higher psychologist at the Rosebery Park Hospital and a visiting fellow at the University of Southampton. So we're going to talk to Paul a bit about his career in that sort of very varied roles he's had. So could you tell us a bit, Paul, about your route into this career?
So I spent 30 years working for Northumbria Police, 14 years of which were spent working as a digital forensic investigator, where I specialised on investigating child abuse crimes, which included both first generation material and material downloaded by those who have an interest in children. During which I retrained. I went back to university. I'd always had a lifelong interest in psychology, and it was actually my wife who badgered me to do it. My wife is a clinical psychologist who lectures at not Northumbria, Newcastle University on the on the clinical doctorate. She also has her own consultancy, ADHD and autism diagnostic service. It followed, her badger and me followed after we'd sat together and watched a documentary about a serial killer. Yeah, I know, very typical thing, I know, but it was advertised as given the backstory to the serial killer, which is what I'm really interested in, you know? But it turned out it just sensationalized what he'd actually done, and I got so annoyed by it. And my wife just turned to me, she said, "You really need to retrain. You've got so much you can bring into psychology." And she planted the idea. Now, at that time, I was in my mid 40s and thought, I'm too old for this. But the seed was planted. And after about 6 months, I decided, do you know what? Why not? So I went back to Northumbria University first, and I did a general psychology master's there. And then I went straight to Newcastle University, where I did a forensic psychology master's, and loved every second. So on completion of those two, I decided it's time to leave. I really want to follow this. So that's how I left. I made a big jump from policing after 30 years. And 2 years ago, well, no, nearly 3 years ago now, started my journey in what forensic psychology down at Rosebery Park.
So could you tell us a bit about the different roles you've had in in the police? Because you talked about your most recent one, which you spoke about very powerfully at the recent DFP conference, and had gave so many people food for thought about how you described your experience of doing that really grueling role.
Yeah, so behind every child abuse investigation is a digital forensic investigator. They are tasked with examining every single digital device that comes in with each case, and there is quite often multiple devices to examine. More often than not, each device contains child abuse material, whether that's first generation, and by that I mean created by the person who have had their digital devices seized, or it's been downloaded from the internet, and you can get it from various sources on there. Every investigation requires the digital forensic investigator to categorize each and every image and video. So each video and each image must be viewed by the digital forensic investigator. And some of those images and videos are really, really harrowing. The acts that are committed to these children are beyond your normal comprehension. And at the time, there was very little mental health support. And as a result, numerous of my colleagues just left the discipline because they simply couldn't view that material anymore. Now, following the completion of my first psychology master's at Northumbria, I began to realize this. So I began to research it in my own time, the mental health effects of working as a DFI. And I was quite surprised to find that there was an awful lot of research which had been done across in the States and Canada. There was none being done in Europe, and there was none being done in the UK at the time. So I began to wonder whether what the research was saying in the US and Canada was applicable to the UK. And I went to my then the manager of the unit, who was a very forward-thinking chap, Richard. He and I are still friends, although he no longer works for Northumbria. And I suggested that we look at introducing a mental health framework to protect the DFIs who worked in my lab. This is how it all started for me, and this is probably what 9 years ago now. And Richard, being the forward-thinking chap that he is, said yes. He said, go away, research it, come back with some ideas. So I went away and I did an awful lot of research. I read just about everything I could find which had explored this area. I created a number of things. We introduced the Wellbeing policy, which looked at, which included mental health support from what was then the occupational health unit. And we looked to see how we could improve that from the research results and the suggestions made from that. We also brought in something that we called a grading policy. Now, at the time, we used to grade every single image and video, and it wasn't uncommon to grade tens of thousands of images and videos at the time. During the research that I was doing, I realized that the Crown Prosecution Service, the Criminal Justice Service, actually have guidelines around what they consider a large collection of child abuse material. And that large collection was sort of closed at 250 Category A images. Category A images are penetrative sexual acts with children, or 1,000 combined across the three categories A, B, and C. So I immediately realized that if we can reduce the number or reduce the exposure of CSAM, reduce the exposure to CSAM images, then in theory, it should reduce the levels of stress and the possibility that DFIs could succumb to the identified stressors within the research, which was post-traumatic stress, anxiety, burnout, and depression. So we working in conjunction with the CPS. The CPS were in full agreement that we could reduce the numbers that we actually grade, as long as we include a caveat in the statement which says X number haven't been graded because we've reached the maximum threshold, as it were. And alongside that, we also introduced the victim ID procedure, and that looked for first generation material. So as long as the victim ID procedure was adhered to and the threshold was met, the case stopped. So it massively reduced the exposure to CSAM material. Now, before these documents, these systems were brought into place, we measured the units mental health stresses at that time using clinically valid measures. The policies were then brought in, and then we measured them again 12 months later, but this time also allowed for qualitative data to be collected as well. So we got thoughts of the DFIs who were working in the unit at the time, thoughts about what they thought of the introduction of these methods. And the results showed across the board there was a reduction in PTSD, depression, anxiety, and burnout. And beautifully, the qualitative comments that were provided by the DFIs actually mirrored the post-study results, if you like. That's how my interest in the mental health effects of working as a DFI began. Since then, I've carried out my own national study within the UK. I did that for my forensic master's dissertation, and it showed that the results that I originally got locally were nationally evident. So DFIs across the country were experiencing difficulties as a result of the work that they were doing. It also highlighted the fact that it wasn't just the exposure to images and movies that were causing the problems, but also reading of the text messages exchanged between individuals who have an interest in children. Because I'm not going to give an example, but they are so graphic that quite often the DFIs were finding themselves driving home and thinking about this.
Mm.
At the end of my service, I succumbed myself to the mental health stresses. working in this arena. And ultimately, that's why I ended up resigning and leaving the job which I loved. It was one of the most difficult decisions I have ever made in my life. Because all I could think about at the time was who's going to do this?
Mm.
Because it really does take a special kind of person to do it and to stick at it for quite a long time. I have seen dozens of people come in thinking they know exactly what they're getting into. And as soon as they have the first exposure to CSAM material because of the acts carried out on these children, within weeks or months they leave.
Mm.
There is absolutely no way you can prepare yourself for what you're about to be exposed to. But since then, I've carried on what has now become a bit of a campaign to raise awareness around the stresses that DFIs are actually can actually succumb to, and in an effort to try and increase the support nationally. And I've done a lot of work around that through Forensic Focus, who have also taken up the baton, if you like. Um, and I've just been contacted tonight, actually, by a company, a digital forensics training company, who are seeking to join forces with a police force a bit further down south, um, to explore the mental health effects of working as a DFI in that particular force. And they've sent out a funding bid to try and make this happen. And they've actually approached me to see if I would come on board with them to guide them through the process and share the knowledge that I've gained over the last 9 years.
Mm.
So things are changing, but they're changing very slowly.
I don't really know what to say, and I feel like I have so many things to say, and I'm not really entirely sure which one should come first. But I feel like the thing that should come first is just to say thank you. Like I feel like your how long you've been doing, how long you did the work, and your point around like it taking a certain type of person, the fact that you did it for 21 years, and the amount of things that you saw and prevented, and just thank you. And then not even that thank you sort of extends to then the fact that you've then gone on with that, and like you continue to make a difference with everything that you do, and the passion, and like how determined you are to make change. So thank you.
That, yeah, that means a lot to me, I have to say. But I haven't lived through it, haven't done the job, and lived through becoming susceptible myself. I want to try and prevent another DFI from
Mm.
going through that. I was incredibly lucky in that my wife saw what it was doing to me and she begged me to stop. And it was entirely down to her that I got the help that excuse me, that I required to recover from that. And I'm quite open about it. I spent 14 months in very 14 months in counselling, with an extremely skilled counsellor, I have to say, to sort of bring myself back to some semblance of normality. And I have to say, again, reflecting on the counselling journey, I actually didn't realize how much my view of the world had changed
Mm.
until I went through that journey. And I've reflected on something that I quite often said to my wife when I was working as a digital forensic investigator. I used to say to her, "You don't live in the real world. You
Mm.
don't know what's going on." But it wasn't her who wasn't living in the real world. It was me, because my view of the world had changed so much. And I don't want another DFI to have to live through that.
And you mentioned CSAM, which I think is child sexual abuse material. Is that right?
That's right, yeah.
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 And you talked about the different grading of the different images.
Yeah.
And the most serious, as you described, having a child being penetrated. What would the other grades be, as it were?
So you have categories A, B, and C. So A is a penetrative sexual activity with a child. B is a non-penetrative sexual activity with a child. And C is a child who is posing naked.
And could these images not now be scanned or looked at via AI rather than a person having to do it and be exposed to that material themselves?
To a degree, yes. There is a system in place across forces within the UK. That system is called CAID, the Child Abuse Image Database. That's what CAID stands for. Now, the way CAID works is at the end of each child abuse investigation, a DFI will hash, I'll explain what that is, will hash all of the images and videos relating to CSAM material. And those hash values are then sent to CAID. And I think it's a 3 monthly basis, CAID will send out an update to each individual force. And what that allows you to do is read the digital devices into CAID, and it will automatically identify every single known image and video, which cuts down, again, beautifully cuts down on the exposure to child abuse material in the first place. However, what CAID cannot do is identify first generation material, so material that has been produced by an individual with an interest in children. That is always going to have to be done, as certainly within the near future, by the investigator, the DFI. And then once they're identified, then CAID can pull them in. So to an extent, AI is assisting the DFIs, but there's still a large proportion of the work that the DFI has to do manually.
I was just thinking, when I worked in one prison, we had a number of people come in to their prison under one particular big operation that arrested a lot of people, and they had lots of images of child abuse, and they talked about collecting, images, and almost like a set of, I've thought of it like football cards, how boys collect football cards, they have to have a whole set of a particular. So how I understood it, a particular episode of abuse, there would be stills from that, and then some of the stills would be held back. So people would always be looking for those particular ones. And so people would collect these series of them. And a police officer at the time talked to us about it and talked about a bit how you're describing, with them having to identify the child that was in the image to prevent it, to try and find if it's still happening. And they would look at things like the curtains or the wallpaper or the carpets to see if they could identify what country it was in. And was this current? Was it so they could identify that the wallpaper might be for sale somewhere, like B&Q or somewhere, so they'd know it was a sort of current thing. And then they described having to identify the child and then go and tell that child, who might still be a child or might now be grown up, that their images were on the internet and couldn't be taken down. And the officers we spoke to were clearly distressed, and this was over 20 years ago. And it's still, I picture it in my mind. He said, I'd get to the gate of a house knowing I was going to change somebody's life, because I was going to go in and tell somebody in that house that this was happening, and that was clearly distressing to him. And as I say, it's impacted on me massively all these years later. So those sorts of things, I think people don't think about in relation to this sort of crime. Really, they think the images are bad enough on their own. They don't think of the impact on the police of having to look at these images and then having to take that next step.
It a huge impact on many people, who are invested in these investigations.
Mm.
So you have the cops who actually go out and seize the evidence. Then you have the digital forensic investigators who actually have to look at it. Then you have Crown Prosecution Service personnel who have to read the statements produced by the DFIs,
Mm.
and these statements are in depth and in detail. So, in fact, there was one stage where we were contacted by the court and asked not to do it
Mm.
because the clerks who were reading the statements were becoming so disturbed by them. So we actually had to take out some of the detail, make them not as graphic as they were, um, and obviously give the graphic side of things when we were called to court.
Mm.
But it's interesting what you say about cops going out and knocking on doors, because obviously that's the first priority in any child abuse investigation where there is first generation material, and it is safeguarding that child. It is the first priority of every single DFI or investigator out there. One of the major cases that I worked on, we ended up working internationally with the FBI, Homeland Security, and the Australian Child Protection Task Force. Many of the victims in the case were stretched across the states. Um, Luckily for the children, the perpetrator had taken quite a lot of images from their social media accounts, and there was, in fact, I'll talk about that in a sec. And the photographs really helped trace and identify and locate the children themselves. Some of the images, which were collected in that case, had GPS location data embedded within the images and videos. Now, this is something that you wouldn't normally see within a photograph or a video, but as a DFI, you have the specialist software to allow you to look at the metadata within the images. And that location data was so accurate, it helped trace and protect. I think there was 112 victims in that case, and we identified every single one of them, and every single one of them was safeguarded.
Mm. Well, that's an incredible achievement just from one case, isn't it?
Yeah.
To be able to do that.
Or the feeling of satisfaction you get when you achieve a result of that, a result such as that, is overwhelming.
Mm.
It's not, I don't care if those children know it was me who safeguarded them. I don't care. All I cared about as a DFI was safeguarding them, making sure they were okay, they were protected, and they received the help that they needed by doing so.
Mm.
Well, what about the support that as DFIs you receive? What was available to you?
Okay, that's a very good question. So, when I first started as a DFI, there you had, if you were lucky, you had an annual check-in where you would go and see a counsellor who would ask you a few questions and send you on your way. And as a result of that check-in, you would get a one-line email which was sent to your supervisor to say you were either fit or not fit to carry out your role. And that happened once a year if you were lucky. It didn't change a lot over the years, to be perfectly honest. In fact, in my opinion, it actually got worse because just prior to me resigning, you got two check-ins, and I use those terms very loosely. You would get one psychometric measuring two psychometrics, one measuring depression, the other anxiety, so the PHQ-9 and GAD-7. You would get them emailed to you. You would fill them in and email them back. That was your check-in. How on earth can you assess someone professionally from two psychometrics which are emailed to you? And because of that, because of the very poor level of support that was offered, the trust in the support was it simply didn't exist. So more often than not, the psychometrics weren't returned. They weren't completed.
Yeah.
People just ignored them
Mm.
because they completely lost faith in the system that was currently being run. And obviously, because they're not interacting with, well, any support, they internalize the feelings of what they're experiencing. And eventually, you just break it. It has to come out somewhere.
Whenever we've done like careers fairs or talking to students who are training to be psychologists, a real common question that we get is, "Oh, I really want to work in the police. Do you know about any psychologist jobs in the police?" Um, it's quite a common question, isn't it, Jerry? People
It
ask that.
is.
Oh, yeah, and I wonder what was your experience of psychology in the police?
None. Actually, we didn't have access to a psychologist. We didn't have access to any real sort of therapeutic process, if you like. I remember when I did become unwell, our occupational health supplier, because it was by then outsourced to someone, sent me to, and again, I'm going to use this term very loosely, a counselor. I was so nervous about going to see this counselor, I actually took my wife because I was afraid of what I was going to say. And we turned up at this particular counselor's house, and all the way through the session, all she did was nod. She didn't interact. She didn't create any conversation. There was nothing, absolutely nothing. And when we came out of that house, my wife looked at me and she said, "You're not going back there. That was an utter waste of time." So the services that I certainly encountered were so just not fit for purpose. And it's not, I have to say, sadly, it's pretty much the same today across the country because I regularly talk to DFIs who reach out to me. And when I ask them what support it is that they get, they pretty much tell me the same. The other big thing is, of course, they are limited to 6 sessions of therapy if they can get it. Now, obviously, having taken the step, moved into psychology myself, I know 6 sessions isn't even going to scrape the surface of the complex trauma that these guys are going through as a result of exposure to the work that they do. Because quite often, a lot of them have done it over a long period of time. And 6 sessions isn't going to undo that complex trauma. But that's all they get.
There's certainly a gap, isn't it, of thinking how can we support people that are doing such an important job and protecting society as they are doing, to to protect everybody else that they're doing this job. So we definitely, that's something that needs taken up, and I'm glad that you're taking that up. And then obviously, if there's anything we can do to support you in that, we're more than happy to do that.
I will absolutely bear that in mind.
Definitely, we'll be more than happy to help you and support your movement in that. And you talked about a person who'd you felt was sort of collecting images and downloaded images rather than for sexual gratification, but for something else. I mean, how did you sort of see? Because I remember when we were working in this field that they the officers would be able to tell us if people had actually even opened the file, because sometimes, as I said, people collect them but not actually even open the file and look at it. It was almost just the art of, or the fact of collecting them that they were trying to do. So I just wondered what your experience of that was.
Yeah, again, really good question. And this rings really true for one of the jobs that I actually worked on. And it was a young chap who had collected a vast amount of CSAM material. And when I examined the electronic device that contained this material, I found that it had been, and I know this is going to sound really wrong, but it's the only way to describe it. It was beautifully catalogued. I've never seen it. I've never seen it before. I've never seen it since. This individual catalogued the images by age, by hair color, by body style, by by actions, and he had them in separate folders. What I didn't realize at the time when I first opened it was this person was autistic. And it turned out, I haven't read the interview transcript, and I wish I had a copy of it. I don't, unfortunately, but the way he described it was it's his special interest. Going back to something that you said earlier, it was they were his football cards. He wasn't collecting it in a for sexual purposes, sexual gratification purposes. He was collecting it because it was his special interest. Now, obviously, within psychology, we realize that autistic individuals do have special interests, many of which don't cross the boundaries of the criminal justice system. However, this young chap who had very little understanding of the sort of, how can I put this, the social norms around relationships and sexual partners, he had no real knowledge about that. And he was desperate to find a girlfriend. And he thought it was fine just to collect this and keep it simply as a collection. And obviously realizing that, because I think it was the first the psychology masters I did. So I had my psychology head on when I saw this and thought, we've got to, we have to talk about this with the criminal justice system. Because obviously, although it's not an excuse as to why he's collected it, it's certainly a mitigating factor as to why he's got this amount of CSAM material. And it was discussed at court, and it was taken on board as a mitigating factor in this case. And this young chap was referred to a very excellent charity who educated them around moral understanding of possessing this material, but also educated them around the sort of not requirements, but the society's understanding of what is and what isn't a correct relationship. And to the best of my knowledge, he never offended again. But I don't think the criminal justice system is properly set up to really understand the impact of neurodiversity on CSAM, if that makes sense. They are experts in the law. I would never argue with that. But when it comes to the impact of neurodiversity and how that affects someone who collects this material, I think it's still very early days. Very early days.
Yeah, and some police stations now employ people to identify if they think that is the case and try to help them through having an appropriate adult with people or having an advocate with them, as the person needs. But it's somebody identifying that in the first place. That's a need, isn't it? That can always not always be obvious to people.
It's a very important need, yeah,
Mm.
because someone who might appear to be an adult may be incredibly vulnerable
Mm.
and socially not as aware as you say you or I, a non-neurodiverse individual might be.
Mm.
And I think a large proportion of people are actually only identified when they do come into the criminal justice system,
Mm.
sadly,
Yeah.
because they can't get the help that they need out on the NHS at the minute because of the current waiting lists.
Mm.
Um, but you're right, having that team at the point of arrest, say, to identify if that person has any neurodiverse needs is hugely important. Hugely.
How is the environment you're working in now different from working in the police?
Oh God, it differs in so many ways. So let me tell you about my first day in forensic psychology. I was taken to experience a multidisciplinary teaming on one of the wards. I work in a medium secure forensic facility. And during that meeting, an incident happened and it got quite tense, shall we say. And on my way back to the office with my colleague who had taken me down to that meeting, he stopped me in my tracks. He put his hand on my shoulder and he said, "Can I just make sure you're okay?" And I looked at him in disbelief. I thought he was winding me up. And it took a couple of seconds. I just looked I said, "Pardon?" He said, "Are you okay after what you've just witnessed?" He says, "Do you need to grab a cup of coffee? Shall we have a debrief? Shall we talk about this? How are you feeling?" And again, I looked at him in absolute disbelief because I'd worked on some horrific cases, absolutely horrific. And I had never once at the end of those cases been asked, "Are you okay? Do you need a break from this?" Not once. And here was a guy who I'd known for a few hours who was putting his hand and was genuinely worried about my well-being. And I looked at him and I said, "You've got absolutely no idea where I've just come from, have you?" And he said, "No." So I explained, and he just looked at me and he went, "Let's have a cup of coffee anyway." And he took me off and we discussed it for about half an hour, while he made sure that, I was okay and not sort of disturbed by what we'd just seen together. The difference between the two, just on that first day, was massive. But something I often reflect on and something that I really value now is weekly check-ins with my supervisor. So weekly reflective practice, if you like, or clinical supervision. And the first part of that clinical supervision is always, how are you? How are you doing? Is there anything we can do to help? Is there any adjustments that we can make to make things easier for you? That, again, was never asked. Not ever. But we get it on a weekly basis. And the difference that makes is huge. And I often think if if that was it, if that was introduced where, supervisors, managers checked in with each team member in a DFU unit on a monthly or on a weekly or even monthly basis, the difference that could make could be huge.
Mm.
Because in private, if a DFI had the trust in that manager or supervisor and was prepared to say, look, this is getting a bit much. I need a break from this. And then that was brought in as a reasonable adjustment for a bit, even if it was a set period of time. The difference that would make to a DFI would be massive. But because of the pressures that digital forensic units have around the number of cases that now come in, because virtually every case has a digital footprint. So almost every single digital forensic unit around the country has a backlog. And because of that backlog, it seems to prevent DFI managers and supervisors from doing that. It's like the human part of digital forensics has been removed, and now it's all about the numbers.
Mm.
But if you could introduce that, it would make such a difference, huge. And the differences between working in policing, where it had become all about the numbers, get the cases through as quick as you can, to moving across to a very caring a very caring role, it's just, there's no comparison. The difference is huge. It's immense.
I really like what you said about the human element, and I was thinking about the how the culture has to change and the climate has to change, because I work in the prison service, Paul, and a prison officer recently asked me how I was. Something had happened during the day, and he came and asked how I was. And I answered, and I really answered. I really told him how I felt. And I could see that by me telling him how I felt, he was a bit taken aback. Well, at least I don't think I said anything that was shocking. Um, and he said, "Oh, you really are, you really gave me an answer then." And I was like, "Yeah, you asked me how I was. Why wouldn't I give you an answer?" How I interpreted his response to me asking was, I think maybe there's something in those environments in the prison service, policing, where we're driven, there's a drive for something else, that even asking how are you, it's the human element is removed, that you have to believe that someone's asking you how you are, and you have to believe that you sharing that is going to be received and heard and contained. So I think like asking is one thing, but like something has to change more widely, that it's like it's people really feel like people want to hear how people are and that it's going to be okay.
Certainly within policing, and there is a lot of research to back this up, and current research I'm talking about here, is the stigma which is still held around help-seeking behaviour.
Mm.
And DFIs in particular, again, I've spoke to many of them and I've heard the same story time and time and time again, is that they are afraid to speak up because of the repercussions which may occur, if they do. They are terrified that they will get either moved out of the job that they are dedicated to. And I don't use that word lightly, I mean dedicated to. Or they will be seen as weak,
Mm.
and it will affect their future prospects. And, you know, as I say, I hear it time and time again. As I heard it back then, I'm still hearing it now, years later. There has to be systematic change around how people working in policing see help-seeking behaviour. It is absolutely not a weakness.
Mm.
It is a massive strength and a huge protective step to maintain your well-being, to stay in the role. But that's not how it's seen.
Mm. And that culture is very prevalent in the prisons and hospitals as well. That sort of, if somebody asks you how you are, you're meant to say, "I'm okay, thanks." Move
Yeah.
on. Talk about
Yeah.
something else. I think people would be genuinely shocked if you actually told them how you were. That would be sort of seen as a very unusual thing. And especially that a psychologist might have feelings about something that's just happened, and that we're not just robots that just let it all just wash over us or something. You've written sort of several journal peer-reviewed sort of articles and commented on sort of wellbeing policy and delivered lectures and things. How do you find talking about this material now and talking about your role? Do you find that's helpful, or do you find brings those feelings back up by talking about it as you did at the conference or here or in other
Yeah,
places?
the case, I actually got caught out actually at the conference because I genuinely didn't realize writing it down is one thing, putting it down as notes for slides is one thing.
Mm,
But as I stood there and discussed the the case and the impact that it had on me personally, verbalizing it, all of the feelings, the emotions that I felt whilst I worked on that particular case came back as I was speaking. And it was incredibly hard for me to stand there in that room and talk about it. And that actually caught me off guard because I didn't realize how emotionally invested I still was.
mm,
Um, I've reflected on that and I will kind of use that in the future. Certain cases you work on which will never leave you
mm,
for reasons of, what happens within those cases. And you resign yourself to that fact.
mm,
And as I found out talking about it in Glasgow, that is one of those cases.
mm.
And it's
You described it so powerfully, and the whole of, I mean, you could hear a pin drop with these sort of people who were completely with you because could see that, it's just it's really serious work you're doing. Preventing that child from being, abused further is a massive task, isn't it? And you did that. So it is a massive task that you undertook. And as we said to you then, as Emily said earlier, all we can do is thank you for what you've done, because that is protecting a child from, their life being even more damaged than it already has been,
you
by
know what
your
what really
perseverance.
what really made me feel incredibly humble at Glasgow was when I finished speaking and I stepped down from the stage, several of the participants in the audience actually came across and they just simply said, "Can I give you a hug?"
Mm,
And that meant so much. It really did.
mm.
Paul, if we had an ability to transport through the screen, I'd give you one now.
It would be readily accepted.
So what have you got ahead? How are you progressing now with your roles, and what are you thinking is your future in this development of your career in psychology?
That's again a really good question because I actually haven't revealed this to anyone yet, so you've got an exclusive.
Ah.
Um, well, there's two really big things coming up. The first is, as you know, I work very closely with Forensic Focus to raise awareness around mental health and digital forensics. And we are about to launch the 2025 Digital Forensics Wellbeing Survey. However, this year I have it backed by three really eminent academics. I've reached out, and I'll explain why I've done this as well. I've reached out to them to see if they will assist in the creation of the survey and its contents and the data and analysis afterwards. But I'm going to look at within the survey itself, one thing that I'm really interested in, and it's a big question that DFIs are often ask of themselves is, how have I lasted this long in this role? Is there something wrong with me because I can do it for so long? And I've pondered this question for a very long time, and my thoughts around this are, if they have experienced trauma throughout their lifetime or, say, in early childhood, then do they then grow to become more resilient to traumatic incidents as an adult? So one of the things the survey is going to explore is that question, specifically that question. The other thing I'm going to explore, and there is, as far as I know, no research done in respect of this within digital forensics, is to explore the effect of being neurodiverse on the stresses that DFIs can succumb to, and whether a different approach needs to be taken to address um, uh, stresses for neurodiverse individuals. Now, we know this for a fact from research that there is a large proportion of neurodiverse individuals who work in digital forensics, yet there's no direct research being done to see if they differ from their non-neurodiverse colleagues. So again, that's something I'm going to explore, and I am hoping to get that launched by December. And back in that, I have Forensic Focus Professor Gavin Oxborough. Gavin, I know you know.
Mm.
Professor Sarah Allen at Northumbria University and Professor Nikki Carthy at Teesside University. So I've got myself quite a support team to prepare this and make sure when it goes out correctly. That is also going to form part of my future. I have decided to undertake a PhD in this area. I think for me, it's the logical step,
Mm.
and I hope it'll give me greater credibility when I'm trying to campaign for more support for DFIs. And the three professors that I've just mentioned are going to be my support team throughout that process. And I hope to get this started in March next year.
Mm. That's
Um,
fantastic. 'Cause I was thinking, for all you've talked about, you've got a PhD in the making, so I'm glad you've taken that step, because that's
Congratulations.
yeah, it's a massive step to take, but it's something that'd be so valued, in terms of, again, not only making a difference to the lives of the children involved in the images, but to those that are protecting those children, and to make a difference to their lives, and the knock on that has to the DFI's families. I was talking to someone recently about staff and support for staff in the prison service and forensic services, and they were talking about research into how families are impacted by having a person that works in that job, and so this has such a big ripple effect for people in society. But so you're not helping just the children, which is obviously massive enough, but also those that are trying to protect them, and then their families as well. So it's a really big ripple effect what you're doing.
well, again, you've just touched on a really important topic, I think, and that is the families of the investigators who are doing this work. It isn't just the investigators who are affected, it is their families as well. And again, I speak from personal experience here because when my mental health was impacted, it wasn't just my wife, it was my son and my daughter who
Mm,
also saw the effect it was having on me. And all three of them, in the end, were begging me to stop and resign and walk away.
mm,
But because my thoughts at the time were, who's going to do this job if I don't? If I leave, who's going
mm,
to do it? And it's something I got a great deal of pride out of doing as well.
mm,
But on reflection, and I've thought about this quite a lot, I'm a bit, at the time I didn't see it, but reflecting back now, having been through counseling and being able to think clearly, I was going out to work to protect children across the world, yet I couldn't see the damage I was doing to my own family, my own
Mm,
kids, my wife.
mm,
And it makes me, it, how can I explain this? I don't understand how I couldn't see that at the time, but it, it hurts. It hurts knowing that I couldn't see that at the time.
mm,
Logically, I understand why, because my view of the world had completely changed and I was completely focused on one thing. But looking back and knowing that I couldn't see that actually hurts me
mm,
because I was protecting all of these other children, yet hurting my own at the same time. Um, I have to say I have actually sat everyone down and discussed this as a family.
mm,
Um, since realizing that, and thankfully they all understand.
mm. I'm sure they're immensely proud of you and what you do.
Yeah, yeah, they are.
But you touched on what we think of as sort of post-traumatic growth, and people that have had things happen, how they can grow stronger and more, and I mean, I don't really like the term resilience because people shouldn't have to be resilient. We should be protected in that way. But definitely, if you've been through some sort of knocks, you tend to be a bit more able to tolerate things than somebody who's getting knocked for the first time, as it were. You have to develop a sort of a bit of a thicker skin and protective barriers around yourself. So, but also, as you said, you're very proud doing that job, and we often think about that as well, how we work in quite extraordinary circumstances, but actually we really enjoy the job and we get satisfaction from the job. So, it is balancing that, isn't it? The damage it could be doing to us, but also what we gain from the jobs and the roles that we take on.
It absolutely is, and it's a very fine line,
Mm.
and
Mm,
it's easily crossed.
mm.
I really like the term post-traumatic growth. Thank you for
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely something we were thinking a lot more about.
saying.
But like I say, it's something that I've often pondered and have encompassed within the wellbeing study that I'm
Mm,
about to launch. I'm really keen to explore it.
mm. That's good. Oh, it sounds a fascinating PhD. I'll be able to can't wait to read it. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been fascinating listening to your journey through the police and into psychology. I'm really pleased you've come over to our side. And it just remains for us to say, let's talk forensic psychology.